AAUW this year. I've been able to write my dissertation chapters. I was able to go into the job market, and luckily just recently signed my contract to start a tenure track at the University of Utah in the Department of Sociology. So thank you. Yeah, I'm just really grateful and honored to be here and share some of my ongoing work. And so today's title is System Impact and Motherwork: How Latinx Families Navigate Criminalization, Health, and Healing. And there's definitely a lot of overlap in Jane's work and the work you've been doing over the years. But I'm kind of gonna, just tell the story here, right? So I'll start off with my positionality and reflexión, right? As many feminists have argued, a lot of the work we do that's personal is political, and that's how I got into my research. I was going to bring the actual book, so this is an anthology that a chapter where I shared my story in when I was an undergrad at UCLA. And then I had my two kids were small. I had Ricky was 1, and my oldest son Benito was 5. I was an undergrad at UCLA, and my youngest son had accidentally gotten burned with an iron, and that initiated a CPS case where they both were removed from my custody. And so I'll share a little bit of what I wrote in this anthology when I began to unpack some of the questions that I have today within my own research. So everyone agreed that the children were healthy and that the burn was accidental. The officers told me, "You'll be good. The kids look all happy and good. We've seen really worse cases." I remember feeling relieved, telling myself that this was just protocol. When everything was over and I said, "Okay, kids, we're getting ready to go," the social worker said, "Ms. Maldonado, the kids are being placed under foster care. My boss and I have ordered an emergency removal." At that moment, my heart dropped. I could not believe what I was hearing. For weeks, I had believed that all of these procedures were simply part of the protocol so they could confirm that my kids were safe with me. I cried, telling the social worker, "How could you do this to them? They are not safe with anyone besides me." I wanted to get on my knees to beg her not to take my children. They had never been away from me. They had never been under a stranger's care. She took my children as they were crying. I tried holding a straight face and told my 5-year-old son to please take care of himself and his brother, and to never separate from each other. They both looked scared, but I had to show them strength so that they could walk away feeling okay. I could not believe that my children had been taken away from me after everything I had done to be a loving mother, dedicating my entire life so that my children wouldn't encounter the unsafe streets that I had navigated, and so that they could have a quality education and everything they needed. As we drove home, I asked myself, what did I do wrong? Where did I fail as a mother? Why was this happening to me? My children did not deserve to go through this. They were being attacked instead of protected. I got home and curled up in a corner, grabbing my knees tight into a fetal position. I cried. Sorry, it still always gets to me. I cried, I pulled my hair, I wanted to die, but I thought about my kids the entire night. How could they be sleeping in a foster home when their beds were at home for them? How could the social worker and others rip away my parental rights? My educational achievements meant nothing. My soul felt dead. I was angry towards the system because its power hurt my children and I. The system had failed us yet again, and this time it felt undefeatable. Luckily, a few months after having support from my mentors at UCLA, attorneys, community, parents, like a lot of people that came together to advocate with me and for my case, I gained custody. My children are with me. I have three boys now. But what I realized in experiencing this case and the separation from my children was that there was a lot of women in the courtroom that didn't have the support that I did as a person who was an undergrad at UCLA, right? I had a lot of support through this process, but a lot of women didn't, and so they ended up having their children adopted for cases like the one that I was going through, or others like domestic violence. And so this initiated a lot of questions for me, which brings me to some of the prior research that I've now done, where I started doing research with gang-affiliated teen moms. And really that also came from being a gang-affiliated and a teen mother myself, and observing how a lot of my friends and people that I grew up with in the neighborhood were being stigmatized in multiple ways with multiple institutions. So this first article that I published really discusses the ways that women navigate educational aspirations and how they're sort of at the intersection of the public and private spheres, right? And navigating the state, schools, hospitals, and at the same time, the home, right? And so from this research, I continued sort of trying to understand the stigma, but what came out of this study was a lot of the conversation around violence. And a lot of the literature of women in gangs focuses on the sexual abuse, the physical, community violence, right? But a lot of it wasn't talking about the institutional violence that women in gangs experience as well, such as from institutions like the criminal legal system and the child welfare system. So I continued expanding this line of work in my master's thesis research, where I continued interviewing gang-affiliated mothers, but now it was a range of younger moms, older moms, because I wanted to see sort of the differences and similarities between criminalization across the life course, where I developed what I call life course criminalization. And here, what was coming out a lot, especially with the older moms, was the long-term effects of being criminalized when you're taking your son, your daughter to the doctors, when a teacher from school calls CPS on you, right? So I started trying to understand what it means for women to navigate multiple institutions at once, right? But for the dissertation, my mentors were like, you can't, do all the institutions, you can't, so like focus on something. And so obviously, from having been involved in the child welfare system and seeing women lose custody to their children, I focus on the child welfare system now specifically, which brings me to my research questions for my dissertation study now, which is, how do child welfare cases impact the mental health and mothering of Latina Chicana mothers after involvement with the child welfare system? And what strategies of motherwork do mothers use to cope and heal from their experiences induced by child welfare surveillance? So for my theoretical framing, I really build on and expand on, different frameworks, intersectional frameworks, starting with Black and Chicana motherwork, which really argues that, women rely on motherwork strategies for the survival of the family and the larger community. Life course theory to really acknowledge and show that different stages and events of life impact how one navigates those experiences of inequalities. And then social determinants of health, to show how economic and political structures also fuel health disparities, right? I'm really interested in the health and healing component of this, so I grab from different fields to really understand this. And I developed my own framework called System Impact in Motherwork, which illuminates the strategies and tools mothers use as they navigate mental health, alongside everyday processes of punishment, surveillance, and healing, how mothers most tied to branches of the punitive systems and are socially constructed as unfit create strategies to navigate microcosms of contemporary US medicalized carceral state. And I refer to microcosm of medicalized carceral state as the ways that child welfare involve mothers. Experiences reflect the larger structural connections of punitive and therapeutic logics between carceral and social welfare ones, right? So how they mirror each other when you have, punitive systems sort of interacting with social welfare ones like the hospital, social services, right? Public institutions. And how these ideologies, conditions, and ecologies make possible the separations and losses sort of possible. So some of the empirical contributions, some of the research that I've been working with has been a lot of the legal scholarship, which I build on and expand. Also looking at the child welfare system as an institution of surveillance and control. It is shown that CPS is a first-line response to family adversity, with cases ranging from lack of food, domestic violence, mental health crisis, etc. And legal scholars argue that parents are racialized and categorized within child maltreatment umbrella concept and within institutional discretion that allows for mother to be legally blamed for unfit parenting. So here my framework posits that multi-institutional dimension of child welfare cases or threats of these cases creates not only like legal, bureaucratic, and institutional entanglement, but also transits into life course criminalization process that generates a multi-legal consciousness and disrupts the legal power of the state. I also build on, Latinx scholars who talk about the ways that state violence matriculates and impacts the well-being of entire families, whether it's access to healthcare or social constructions of Latina motherhood. And I also expand on stigma, race, gender, right, intersectional components of social determinants of health, where I argue that the child welfare system as an institution is a social determinant of health, because there are, more than 3.5 million children a year involved in the system. Over 80% of mothers have custody of children, and so this is the reason why they get blamed for the neglect and the abuse. So I'm really interested in unpacking it and contributing to seeing this institution as a social determinant of health. So System Impact and Motherwork offers a conceptual mapping of the process in which mothers create maternal strategies to navigate criminalization. In this process, this framework shows the interdependence of institutions, time, context, and the relationships, physical, material, spiritual, that make healing possible. So system impact, it refers to being impacted by several systems: criminal, legal, child welfare, social services, right? How these systems and institutions of social control sort of frame being unfit, and how there's a lot of stigma and punishment related to that. So what I argue is that they criminalize the health of people in doing that, right? Now my framework is more situated in the circles over here, where I talk about the ways that mothers develop a matriarch consciousness that's really rooted and grounded also in the historical trauma that has been brought, forth across generations, but also develops across the life course for many of these women. I talk about safety, material resources, and healing, and I'll come back in the ways that these have come out in the interviews that I've done in my research. So for this study, I recruited Latina Chicana mothers from Southern California, primarily from Los Angeles and the Inland Empire, so Riverside County, San Bernardino, who had a previous case with CPS. I conducted photo elicitation testimonials, so they shared their stories via photographs, and I also had questions to sort of probe on the stories that they were sharing. So sometimes they brought physical photos, other times they shared photos in their phone, sometimes art, and I'm happy to talk more about methods in Q&A. And I also conducted 5 legal case content analysis, so they shared their case files, and I sort of quoted through those to understand what the state was saying in transcript and argument in order to remove and adopt children. I want to contextualize criminalization a little bit. A lot of the mothers that I've worked with come from neighborhoods that are poor, working class, right, but are also hyper criminalized, right? So this map here is from the $1 Million Hoods projects that's from UCLA, where they've done studies that show some communities invest millions of dollars to incarcerate and arrest people, right? The mothers that I've been working with are the darkest red, right, which is west side of South Central, east side of South Central, where there's a big fiscal investment to incarcerate and arrest people, right? Oftentimes, the numbers show that it's men that are getting incarcerated, but the parallel for women would be the parallel of getting involved with child welfare system, right? And so we see sort of the parallels of the investment of the state to incarcerate and arrest rather than provide services to help, households that end up staying, single households when men get incarcerated, or vice versa, right? When women get incarcerated, what do we do when there's a larger investment to punish rather than help communities heal? So this visual really shows the tensions that exist with system involvement in communities like the communities I work with, right? South Central and the Inland Empire. So in coming back, some of the tenets of system impact and motherwork, as I mentioned, are safety, material resources, and healing. And so I'll be talking about how they cultivate intergenerational safety, how what materialized grief looks like, and healing while programming. So through my framework and the following examples that I will share, show how multi-institutional criminalization from CPS, schools, hospitals are complicit in the violence women experience, and highlight the ways that mothers recreate, unlearn, and relearn how to navigate contemporary modes of surveillance and punishment. So I'll go ahead and start. Okay, so it's not gonna, I don't think it's gonna play loud, but wanted
Can
to
you
share.
hold the microphone up?
Oh yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Maybe just read it.
Yeah, I'll read it. Okay. So I wanted to just share directly. So Esmeralda lost temporary custody of her children after she tried committing suicide from overdosing on pills. During a mental health crisis that occurred due to severe domestic violence, she was taken to different psych ward facilities for an entire year, where she recalls missing her children, completely depressed, wanting to die, and not eating or sleeping. Although Esmeralda urgently asked for help, the court did not order therapy and instead ordered extensive drug testing, forcing her to navigate criminal, juvenile, and family courts. Over the years, these psychological harms generated an awareness of the tragic responses from CPS that arise through the interconnected punishment in healthcare and legal systems. So Esmeralda's experiences of violence led to her involvement in community organizing, where she focused on cultivating safety through healing rituals such as community circles that manifested through her advocacy and policy change. So she shares, "They showered my daughter and sent her to school the next day. Instead of like nothing happened. She's gonna go to school knowing that they seen her mom take these pills and get dragged. Then my daughter, the DCFS case reported that Daniel pulled her hair, and my daughter said that he hit her. I was so mad, I didn't know about this. Then basically the courts were blaming me, saying that I allowed this to happen. This happened to me, like he did this to me. You guys making it seem like I'm the crazy one because I went 50-150. I'm just like, no, you guys should be questioning, why did I do that? Is there a reason for why you do that? Nobody asked or questioned what the fuck was going on with me. They said that I was doing it out of anger. I was just like, what? Y'all are crazy. DCFS, the court, y'all are a mess. Like, you guys are not here to support families or the mothers or the victims. And I'm just like, you guys are just there to make them seem like they're the crazy ones. So, Esmeralda, as she was, sharing her story, she was sharing how, there was so many institutions coming at her at once while she was trying to just process domestic violence and mental health crisis that she had, right? So Esmeralda's journey reflects the process of what I term system impact and motherwork, a suffering that happens through family separation and deteriorates the mental health of poor women of color in the system, yet leads to unimaginable possibilities for collective healing. Esmeralda's story is one of many that get lost in child protective cases of child abuse and neglect. And I do want to note that I don't want to romanticize or victimize any of the moms in the study, but rather show the messiness that exists within system involvement more largely, right? So intergenerational safety refers to the ways that mothers create safety within and outside institutions of social or therapeutic control. System impact and motherwork captures the ways that mothers develop ideas of safety from their own experiences within psych wards and carceral institutions, as well as those learned in the family and the community. So Esmeralda shared a patient safety plan here that was given to her in the psych ward. And in her experiences there, she was sharing how, there was a lot of like carceral control, right? In terms of like, was she fit to come out of the psych ward and be a fit mom, rather than sort of creating a safe space for her to heal, right? Which is supposed to be part of the process within these therapeutic sort of institutions. And so she says that with those experiences that she saw being in juvenile hall, right, incarcerated, and being in the psych ward, she learned to develop safety models for herself and her children and her larger community through these experiences of being unsafe in these spaces. She also shared stories about her being an advocate alongside her grandfather. Her grandfather was a white communist man who was her teacher in first grade, who ended up adopting her and sort of mentoring her across her life. And so she says that she would go to a lot of protests, immigration protests, labor protests, a lot of different ones, where she learned to organize and observe how her grandfather and her family were doing that, right? And so she learned safety through that, right? Community and family support as well. Now she also shares the ways that she now translates a lot of that with policy change that she's involved. So she's involved in a lot of California policy change for families impacted by incarceration. And so this is, again, she's grabbing from what she learned in carceral institutions, from community, from family, to develop new forms of safety that have intergenerational impact, right? She's not only thinking about all the things she's been through and the ways that her mom also went through these systems, but also thinking about what's next for her children in the larger community. Another aspect of system impact and motherwork is materialized grief, which is the emotional process where mothers move with grief after loss, separation of children, to create physical spaces to process this grief. Mothers move this grief from an emotion to a material resource shaped by relating to each other. The emotional and mental capacity to endure grief creates an interdependent culture of recovery from loss, where spaces are created by only those who can understand grief of wrongfully losing a child. So this is the case of Alisa, Salvadorian mother of 7 from San Bernardino County. Alisa's story is, has been one of the hardest ones to also work with, because she, Esmeralda, she was in CPS and got custody back, like many of the moms did, but Alisa didn't, right? She lost custody after there was a case of her husband cheating on her. He had another, woman, and she got pregnant. The other woman ended up killing her son, and so the state came to her saying, she was sort of involved in this when she didn't have nothing to do with the other relationship. This case has been, again, really hard to work with. So Alisa shares, another thing to note is that Alisa's children were adopted. The youngest children were adopted, and the older 2 daughters who were in foster care weren't. So some children were returned and others weren't, right? Again, that's another complexity to note here. If you are framed as unfit to parent, you should be sort of framed as unfit to parent all, but the state came in. The same people who worked in the court ended up adopting her youngest children. So everything was favorable. The reports from the psychologists, the classes that they send you to take, everything is for the money, Katherine. Nothing is for helping or for well-being. Nothing is for help in San Bernardino. I mentioned it and even my stomach hurts. That psychologically left me back to the point where I cried about everything that I looked at or saw. I had nights that I could not sleep. So many things happened that if I was in the house where my friends saw a patrol passing by, it scared me because I said, oh, they're coming to look for me. And not because I was guilty, no, because they already had me so intimidated. It lowered my morals, they put me through the worst, they humiliated me. If my daughters would tell you, they were there for 5 years, and they changed them from 14 to 17 houses.
Oh my God.
Sometimes the death of a child, even if it's natural death, you cannot get over it. Worse now, when your children have been taken from you, you know that your children are alive, but you don't know where they are. So I had to find my sisters in the church to help me process this grief. And so this is, again, this term that I'm using here is what a lot of the moms are sort of showing here, right? That they build community physical spaces to process the grief that the state sort of has induced, right? This form of like social death that's created with removal and separation of children, right? And so a lot of them talk about the ways that, they start selling, the Enfamil milks, like the WIC, WIC is a organization that gives sort of support to low-income mothers, right, with food, things like milk and baby milk. So they talk about the ways that sort of they materialize this grief by like supporting each other with resources, but also building spaces to process the grief more collectively with folks who have had their children taken, but also others that are just community members that want to support this like sort of this grief that they're navigating. Another dimension is healing while programming, which involves the tools families learn and create to heal and recover from the harm they've experienced and inflicted on others. The tools often come from accountability practices and programs or support groups mothers are involved in. So this framework brings these different levels of healing to complicate the relationship of Latinx families to the state, right? This is the case of Lupe, undocumented Guatemalan mother of 1 from LA County. Lupe had her son removed after she experienced a crisis with an overdose of drugs, where she ended up in rehabilitation center. Luckily, she had the support from her sisters and larger community to sort of go through this recovery, right? This is a paper here, a legal document that shares her release order. Again, a lot of the moms were able to share this happy moment, right? When I'm listening to the story where it's like the release orders, you gain custody back. You sort of went through the recovery or other requirements from the state to gain that custody, right? But for Lupe and other mothers in the study, they talk about the ways that the programming itself helped their healing, right? Building that space again with other meth addicts, other women who had been in domestic violence, you know, building that support group to really navigate that separation from their children, and alongside all the other things, right? A lot of the women also talk about the traumas that they went through their migration journey, and then they get here and they end up using drugs, and then their children get removed, and it's just like a cycle of violence and trauma, right? But the programming aspect of it is something that really caught my attention, because I think there's several levels of like intervention that can be made when we take a non-punitive approach to healing within these organizations and institutions that claim to be supporting mothers and children, right? But there's, again, complexities, right? When we think about fit and unfit motherhood. A lot of times policies in child welfare system are pushed forward because, you know, the larger public can say, well, a mother who's using drugs shouldn't be neglecting her children, shouldn't be, right? And that's all, you know, I take all of that into consideration because I want to understand sort of more of the root causes and what do we do to actually support people who are marginalized in these positions, right? Yahaira, undocumented Guatemalan mother of three, you know, who was also in the rehabilitation center, also had problems with drugs. You know, she shares, now thanks to God, good, because now we have time that we can actually enjoy together. That she's talking about her and her children. Before with the drug, we would choose to be more with the drug and like not care about the kids. Now I regret it. It hurts to say that the drug is preferred in those moments, but truth is, the groups have helped me a lot. They've given me like an open mind because they've made me tough in ways that when I get anxiety and want to consume, like it goes away because they've given me tools, everything I need so I won't consume. When I think about wanting to consume, I remember the classes and how to control myself, right? So again, she's talking about this healing that's happening while programming in the midst of also being away from her children, which a lot of them are talking about when they're trying to navigate crisis in relation to, you know, whether it's domestic violence, what they went while they were incarcerated, separation from children, right? A lot of that is just remembering the tools that have been developed through the programming and in community with, you know, sisters of the church or other examples, right? This is just one that really shows, right, where they also talk about the ways they take accountability, right? It's not just one way, it's not just the state down, and it's like, this is a collective sort of trauma that's happening at the same time, which is something that I want to complicate in my own research, in understanding this institution as an institution of social control. So healing as a place of both critique and conflict with the state. In this conflict, racialized trauma comes to show how the relationship with the state continues to shift. So some implications, theoretical ones are, it encourages scholars and practitioners to examine long-term healing for Latinx families in mental health crisis amidst punishment and violence. Some empirical implications are examining the racialized biopsychosocial dimensions of experiencing criminalization. System-involved families have generational understanding of the ways that the body, mind, and spirit health is affected across the life course. And practical or child welfare policies such as risk assessments that are given to parents and children in these intakes, right, can be transformed by understanding and taking a more healing-centric approach. Healthcare policies such as mental health responses and other public institutions, schools, social services, churches, can create a paradigm shift in the ways we view families in crisis and support their healing. So that's what I have, and thank you so much again for listening.
Any questions on that? That's yeah.
Must be something we can do.
Yes, I have a question about these support groups. Are these some kind of a government-sponsored support group, or is it just within the local community, or a combination of both?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. Yeah. So
Can you repeat the question?
yeah. So Anita asked if these are governmental support groups or community oriented or both, and I said it's both. Because when they get CPS cases, they're mandated to take, these drug courses or parenting classes, domestic violence classes, right? But then from these sometimes stem like more inner support groups where they can, kind of be away from like state involvement. So sometimes it's a mix. For the most part, it's a mix of both. That they meet women who are going through similar situations, and then they kind of do these underground sort of groups outside of that.
Do you have any idea? I don't even know what the success, how you would evaluate it, but can you evaluate the success of these groups and how successful has it been?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I've been trying to grapple with in the own interviews. That some of them are like, I did not like going to those classes. I did not, it was so punitive. But then there's other ones where they're like, I learned so much, right? And I think it really comes from, a lot of the women were mandated through like the AA, so Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Like, so a lot of them share when they were there, right? It was both like helping them take accountability with more supportive services, right? Like teaching them how to meditate, how to do breath work, like things like that. And then others were more like, you can't talk, you can't see, you can't get out of here. It was more like controlled. And so if I were to sort of measure the success, I think it would be in like what's less punitive, that sort of removes the state from continuing to punish through the healing process. Because then otherwise women feel like they're continuing to be blamed for the same thing, and then they can't step out of that zone, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for sharing your story and your research with us. And I actually have two questions. So my first question is, have you been able to present any of this to any of these agencies that might be able to rethink some of the ways that they're doing things?
Yeah, I haven't been able. I've been able to present in spaces where there's people who work for nonprofits, TV, like and so I'm able to sort of have these conversations, not specifically for these centers. I mean, I hope that the book is able to kind of expand a lot of this to sort of get at those issues and like how do we do it from like an organizational place where we can support more marginalized mothers collectively, right? As a collective responsibility, but I haven't yet.
Yeah. And then my second question is, what's next for you in your research, especially as you're going into a tenure track position?
Yeah. So, my dissertation will be the sort of the draft of the book. I want to come back to because I did LA and the Inland Empire, so I want to do interviews in Santa Barbara and San Diego, so I could have like a Southern California sort of understanding of how women are working with CPS, healing, right? All these things that I talk about. So I'll collect more data and then sort of work on the book from that. But after, I do want to do sort of transnational work. So in the U.S. and Mexico and Central America, working with mothers in rehabilitation centers. I think they have a lot to teach us about not only motherwork strategies, but also like healing from a place of being wounded. So I want to understand them when they're in those spaces of rehabilitation, because I've done some work with people in Mexico, and there's a lot of cases in Central America. So I just want to continue expanding it from like a transnational lens. Thank you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you for this powerful research. I'm wondering if any of the mothers you interviewed spoke about being questioned by state institutions or not even state institutions because they did not look like their children. And I say that from a personal point of view. I'm not Latina, but obviously I'm brown. My children are white passing. And I find at their schools, at the doctor's office, we also don't have the same last name. I get questioned a lot about, they don't come right out and ask if they're my children, but there's a whole lot of questioning and surprise when they finally figure it out. And that, I mean, that's something, right, that I'm very fearful of in terms of, gosh, would someone ever see us out together and report, like when they go out with my parents? And I've heard that happening, grandparents, right,
Yeah.
traveling with children who don't look like them and getting pulled over and questioned and detained. And so I'm wondering if the mothers talked about that at all.
Yeah, not you know, the mothers that I work with. I mean, I think about it personally too. My children, when they were younger, they were like blonde too. Like, so I had instances like that too. Or when my dad is Guatemalan, so he's like super dark skinned too, and he's been questioned when he had my boys. So that dynamic is interesting in terms of the racialization process that sort of causes the state to intervene, or in one ways, right? I did hear, you know, one of the moms who has mixed children. She's Mexican and her children are all Afro-Latino boys. So she talks about those interactions being super complicated too when she had, you know, the state intervene. So I think that's something more to like continue thinking about. But I have heard cases when people come in just based on skin color. Yeah, thank you.
You can see in the cases where there's drug and alcohol problems, but in your case, where it was accidental, it seems like there should be some advocate group or some legal group that you can turn to. Is there anything like that? Because that seemed terribly unfair.
Yeah, there wasn't, you know, there was like the public defender who was, you know, part of it. There was the social workers who, you know, you have an attorney, your children have an attorney, the state has an attorney. But through the whole process, it was just like what the social workers wrote and what the officers sort of wrote, right? What I wrote in the chapter when I wrote it was that there was a lot of like questioning around like, you know, you're a young mom, how do you even know how to parent from the social worker? You were in gangs, like how do you, like, so there was a lot of questioning around those, and so that's why like the whole like stigma is very real in the interactions with the social worker, because discretionary practices can frame a parent however they want. And when I reviewed my paperwork after, and then when I review the paperwork of all the files that I review now, it's like they use these same sort of logics to say this parent, she cannot parent. You know, it's like she's a neglectful, or she's likely to, right? But yeah, I think that ideally there are some organizations that are sort of moving to understand the system as like through family policing lens, that are trying to create like know your rights workshops, you know, sort of more advocacy groups. But we need a lot more, because we're just beginning to sort of unpack this. And so with cases like, you know, I don't know if you're all familiar with cases like Gabriel Fernandez, the Netflix series. So that one really pushed for a lot of punitive policy, because, you know, he ended up dead, and so they framed it as like the system needs work and it's broken. And yes, it is, but it continues to be on a more punitive side rather than being like, well, what are we doing when parents, the percentage of parents who are actually abusing is very small, because most of the cases are for neglect. Over 75% are for lack of food, housing, mental health crisis. So really like the problem is more of a poverty and like racism one, rather than like, you know, these parents are abusing. And so once we begin to unpack that, you know, obviously like the implications of it, I wish that it had more on that angle. Like we need more legal support groups in the actual like courts, in the services that you're sending them to. But again, one that's not like, you know, I'm gonna report you on this because you said this, right? Like it's more complicated than that, and we as parents know that, right? Yeah.
Well, you're doing very important work. Thank you.
Thank you.
You got a question there in the back?
Yeah.
When I first came to Santa Barbara over 20 years ago, I investigated CALM and some of the other programs because I had been working in a child abuse prevention program in Modesto, and I was so surprised that there was no respite care situation here. When they took a child away, they had foster homes, they had whatever. But in Modesto, we fundraised and had a home that could have 8 kids overnight. It had a boys' room, a girls' room, a nursery, and they could come and have a respite from all those issues, or go to a doctor's appointment without hollering the kids and getting scolded. So I was really surprised. To me, that was a model 20 years ago that could be replicated and could be very positive, but I still don't see it that much.
Yeah, I haven't heard much of that too. It's always like because I've heard even when like brothers and sisters get separated, even that, you know, like I see like when the moms talk about their daughters who are older, and they're like how much it hurt them to like be separated, and now the trauma that the children got to deal with when they were in the foster homes. So I think that would be when and if like the state does intervene, that would be a good model to sort of, you know, think about like what are the actual, you know, components of healing that are implemented in that process, right? When you're in the foster, when you're in rehab, when you're, you know, in the 5150 hold, like when you're in a psych ward, right? These are the places that I think can help us. We can learn from it, right? In ways that we learn how not to be punitive.
It was a safe place and they could get help too. I mean, the staff was trained, you know, we work with people that, you know, we work with CPS, we work with different groups that actually refer people there and things. So it seemed to me like we haven't proceeded that much.
Yeah, yeah.
I worked at the Tri-Counties Regional Center for a while doing external audits, but the thing that I noticed there is that with the developmentally abled community, they had the respite care. They could get respite cares for parents and caregivers, and it was an extremely important concept that people need to get a break.
Yeah.
And I was a single parent, only had one kid, but you know, you go a little nuts sometimes. That's all there is to it.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, those are some of the things that I want to be able to, especially when talking about like mental health, rather than like diagnosing people and saying like something's wrong with you. Like it's so normal to need breaks and get into crisis, especially when you're struggling to get food and you're struggling to come back from like recently migrating. Like how do you unpack that? And I don't think we have a lot of spaces to do that, right? Like to have that space. Like,
No,
yeah.
it's so sad.
So I have another question. So do you visualize that in the future you like present your research and your data to perhaps to a city or county to show them how the system can possibly be changed?
Yeah, I think about it in different like ways, right? Like ideally I would want to, you know, get at the people who are working in the cases. So like, you know, the public defenders, the social workers, all the people in the resources, like we can have a lot of, you know, all of them together and think about like, if the system is intervening in these ways, kind of my pushback is like, these are the ways, this is what mothers are sharing, all right? And this is what the data is showing across the nation for Indigenous, Black, Latinx families, right? And so ideally I would want to be able to say like, these are the, you know, starting from like what other scholars in this area share, which is like, social workers have so much caseloads, like why in the first place, like starting from like the number and amount of children that enter the system to like, these are the approaches that are more healing centered that we can take. So ideally that's what I would want like to do on the long run, across like the nation.
Kind of building on that, I'm thinking about Jane's presentation about her organization and what you presented. And I'm wondering, would a group like that, do you think that would have been helpful for these mothers? Would they have used it? And obviously there was a lot more going on probably than the group could address, but would that have been something they even knew about? Would they have used it? And then on the other side, do you receive calls like this from mothers? And if so, how do you advise them?
Well, I can speak to this very passionately. It's known around the world what we're doing wrong. And we need to sit down and figure it out. And people are. And then you enter into public policy and the whole issue, and it's so slow because you're dealing with institutions. But we've come a long way, at least in terms of when I admire what you're doing. It's extremely important that we continue this kind of research. What worries me, and this is what you're getting at, it cannot just be academic. It has to come from the heart, so that we, thank you Janice, talk about respite care. I mean, I've been in Australia where they have this system which is in place, but they have national health care and they have national funding, and it's a different system. We have 50 different states and we have all these complexities in public health, and the fact that there is no respite. I've wanted to have something in Santa Barbara County, but who would fund it here? Because what you see is if you can help people during pregnancy is the window of opportunity. That's when everybody does get care. Remarkably, that's when, assuming they can get to care.
Yeah.
But they're usually caught in the system. I mean, across the board, from the people who have no funds to the wealthy, we have to figure this out because of insurance, and it has improved, but there's a long way to go. And of course, the underlying, for me, is the intergenerational and ongoing trauma that immigration, famine, poverty, war, this is what continues to haunt us now we add in global warming. So, all of these things are overwhelming. So it has to go down to me, to the community and the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I'm of course fascinated by when I hear about gang violence or I hear about something that's not appropriately, I keep thinking, where are the mothers? And where are the men, of course, they're incarcerated. Or they've been caught up in the snare of all of that, which make it back to the mothers. So it's back to we can, I think, tease it out. But it takes people who know their own neighborhoods.
Yeah. No, it just briefly as you were presenting, that's kind of what I was thinking about, and because I'm always too like, what do we do? How do we do this? And so I think those groups that are created organically are oftentimes what moms are like talking about. Like,
that's right.
We call it like cundinas in Spanish, which is like these like underground savings that we do to like support each other when crisis happens, right? Things like that. But like if there was more of a national understanding and support, right? Like within, especially going to the doctor and all that, I think there's a good point in terms of like when are we receiving care and how is care even being framed and given, right? That's another part. Yeah.
Well, I saw an interesting piece on, I think it was on PBS last time, where they were talking about that there are areas in this country, and I think LA is one, to where they put money into putting people in prison. That is their entire point.
Yeah.
Get these people off the street. Get them out of there. And not dealing with any of the problems. And if you have that kind of attitude within any kind of authority, you're between a rock and a hard place, and then you end up with fathers in prison and mothers trying to cope. And so there's so many levels of this kind of thing going on that I agree with Jane. It has to come at the grassroots is where it has to come from, and people saying, no, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We need this. We're going to get it, and I don't know. There are days when I just turn off the TV because it's just terrible. I read mysteries.
Yeah. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I do too.